pen is mightier than the sword kind of person. What do I mean by this? Good question, Mr. Wu. Well, by this, I mean that she didn't use direct force to fight against racist discrimination. She used her poetry, her stories, and her plays. Now, she's quoted many times saying that when she was at a loss for strength, for courage, of motivation, she would turn to this poem, Still I Rise, for motivation, to help her to continue to fight the good fight. Now, before we can analyze this poem, we have to first understand the world she was trying to change.
Behind you, volume, that green light, on the wall. No, you just take it off now.
Today we'll be learning more about the history of the American Civil Rights Movement. The end of the American Civil War in 1865 effectively meant the end of slavery, but African Americans were in for a long struggle before they were finally awarded equal rights. As of 1870, all eligible male citizens were able to vote. However, blacks were discouraged to by violence and eventually legal stipulations. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled to maintain racial segregation in private businesses in a case called Plessy versus Ferguson. Soon broadened to include schools, many southern states applied this separate but equal mentality to all aspects of life. However, this led to the application of Jim Crow laws, which resulted in blacks being treated as second-class citizens. Segregated schools, public transit, restrooms, water fountains, and more continued well into the 1900s. In 1909, a group of prominent black and white campaigners created the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP. Their goal was to increase racial equality and challenge issues like the Jim Crow laws. Unfortunately, it was between 1910 and 1930 that white supremacist group the Ku Klux Klan saw its biggest expansion amid increased racial friction. Following the First World War, the NAACP was devoted to ending lynching by white vigilantes. By mid-century, the group became instrumental in the Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka court case. This class action suit, filed in 1951, asked that segregation in schools be struck down. Taken to the Supreme Court, the case resulted in the first integrated school in the United States to open in the fall of 1955. Encouraged by the decision, the civil rights movement began to hold high-profile boycotts, marches, sit-ins, and other peaceful protests. These included 1955's Montgomery bus boycott in support of Rosa Parks. A watershed moment came in 1957 when a high school in Arkansas admitted a group of African American students nicknamed the Little Rock Nine. Protested by fellow students, the governor, and even the state's National Guard, President Dwight Eisenhower eventually intervened to ensure the students' safe passage. By 1962, universities also began integrating, though black students were still met with protests and violence. The Southern Freedom Movement continued into the 60s with support from newly elected President John F. Kennedy and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy. The violence of the Birmingham, Alabama campaign influenced the president to fully endorse the movement.
A great change is at hand, and our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all.
On June 19, 1963, he proposed a civil rights bill to Congress, which was approved in 1964 after his death with support from President Lyndon Johnson. The bill struck down existing legislation that allowed for discrimination, and its approval was largely influenced by Martin Luther King Jr. and the March on Washington of August 1963.
With this faith, we will be able to transform the dwindling discord of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood.
Capturing the attention of the media and the population, this event attracted hundreds of thousands of people in support of civil rights. Following that, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 ended the prejudiced voting system. Instantly effective, blacks began voting and running for public office. However, just days later, on August 11th, a violent six-day riot in the Los Angeles neighborhood of Watts resulted in 34 deaths. This was indicative of a period of racially motivated violence that occurred in the mid to late 1960s. This era also saw the rise of Black Power, led in large part by Stokely Carmichael, in opposition to extremists like the Ku Klux Klan. This ideology was exemplified by the Black Panther Party, which followed the principles set forth by Malcolm X. Rising to prominence in the 1950s, his radical ideas advocated militancy for blacks.
Black people are dissatisfied. They're dissatisfied not only with the white man, but they're dissatisfied with these Negroes who have been sitting around here posing as leaders and spokesmen for black people and actually making the problem worse instead of making the problem better.
He remained an influential and controversial human rights activist until his assassination in 1965. The murders of civil rights leaders continued when Martin Luther King Jr. was killed in April 1968 and Robert Kennedy 2 months later. Despite racial tensions continuing into the 1990s, progress has been measurable. The election of President Barack Obama in 2008 is seen by many to be a culmination of centuries of work in favor of racial equality.
This is the meaning of our liberty and our creed, why men and women and children of every race and every faith can join in celebration across this magnificent mall, and why a man whose father less than 60 years ago might not have been served at a local restaurant can now stand before you to take a most sacred oath.
To continue our discussion, let me ask you a question. What do you remember from your life when you were 8 years old? Nothing specific, just a broad overview, like emotions.
I was happy.
Well, my Anglou, at a young age, had to accept a harsh reality, that nothing in this world is perfect. At the young age of 8 years old, she was raped by her mother's boyfriend, Mr. Freeman. But that trauma did not break her, but instead built her. She used literature as a coping mechanism, which later in her life produced many works of art like Still I Rise, I Know Why Kgothatso Sings, and Woman's Work. My Anglou used said abilities in literature in the 1960s to help the civil rights movement with her literature. She advanced the civil rights movement with her literature by giving out works of I can't find the word to express it. Works of lyrical genius, if I may say, as a way of oppressing, of resisting the oppression. Now to read the poem Still I Rise, Maya Angelou herself.
You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still like dust, I'll rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? Just 'cause I walk as if I have oil wells pumping in my living room. Just like suns and like moons, with the certainty of times, just like hope springing high, still I rise. Did you want to see me broken? Bowed head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries. Does my sassiness upset you? Don't take it so hard just 'cause I laugh. As if I have gold mines digging in my own backyard. You can shoot me with your words, you can cut me with your lies, you can kill me with your hatefulness, but just like life, I'll rise. Does my sexiness offend you? Oh. Does it come as a surprise that I dance? As if I have diamonds at the meeting of my thighs. Out of the huts of history's shame I rise. Up from a past rooted in pain I rise. A black ocean leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I bear in the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak miraculously clear, I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave. I am the hope and the dream of the slave. And so, naturally, there I go rising.
These are some very powerful words by a very powerful woman. Now, looking at stanza 1, in line 1, you may write me down in history. In this line, Maya Angelou refers to the large part of American history during which black people were seen as inferior to the white American people. Now, from the second line, we see that from her choice of words that she doesn't really care what these people think of her, what the oppressor thinks of her, because she knows that ultimately their opinions will be biased. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise. Trod me in the very dirt. To me, that's trod. Trod means to walk on. Now, if I'm walking on you, it means I see you as dirt. Both literally and metaphorically, dirt is the lowest of the low. If someone calls you a piece of dirt, that's a huge insult they've given you. So now, naturally, here Maya Angelou says that they walk on her and they undermine her, they see her as the lowest of the low. But still, like dust, she'll rise. Now she changes the image. She's no longer dirt, but now she's dust. Can anyone tell me the difference between dust and dirt?
I've got something to add, because like if you tramp on dirt, it makes dust. So even if you feel that, or if you call someone dirt, if you stand on them, you're actually lifting them up, because dust rises.
Okay, interesting idea, because like the only way is up, right? So naturally, like dirt, she become dust and rise. But now, what is dust? Does anyone know what dust is? I see something here, Mr. Mbali.
Dirt is something like soil, which is particles like rocks, broken small rocks. But dust, it's how is it?
Okay, I like the first part of his answer. Small pieces of dirt. Now, in the same way that, remember a couple of weeks ago when it was so windy and so dusty, we couldn't walk with our eyes open. The dust was coming in our eyes and we had to walk like this. Now, it's clear that these same small things that we look down upon were hurting us. In the same way, Maya Angelou says, even though they see her as nothing, as inferior, she may still surprise them and perhaps even hurt them. Now, in second stanza, my mind races back to Christmas time. I was walking in the kitchen and I see this small cousin of mine saying this, "Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you so sad? Is it because I ate the last cupcake?" So, to me, this boy had an arrogant confidence about him because he knew that I couldn't lay a finger on him. And even if I did, the fact of the matter was that the cupcake was gone. I mean, he had it, I couldn't have it anymore. So, in the same way, Maya Angelou says she realizes that she's confident and that even if she's ill-treated, even if she is oppressed, she may fade, she may be assassinated, much like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, but the idea of freedom, of equality, will continue to persist. Now, there's a figure of speech in the third line of stanza 2. Can anyone tell me what it is? Yes, it's a simile. Now, we know that most of the Middle Eastern countries have built their economy on oil, right? So oil is something of great value. Now she says, why are you beset with gloom? beset with gloom, why are you so sad? Is it because I walk like I've got oil wells? Is it because I walk like I'm a very wealthy man? Do I walk like I've got the world at my feet? Do I walk like excuse me? But nonetheless, this shows the pride that she had in herself and in her idea that black people and white people are equal. Finally, the third line, just like moons and like suns, with the certainty of tides, just like hope springing high, still I'll rise. Now, this can be said in another way. Just like we know that the moon will come up this evening, just like we know that the sun will come up tomorrow morning, just like we know that there will be a swirl at sea, we know that Maya Angelou will continue to fight against racial discrimination. Now, there's another figure of speech in that third line in stanza 3 there. Anyone care to pick it out for us? It's right above our photographer's head there. It's a simile, just like hope springing high. This shows that even though they've come from Maya Angelou herself and her fellow black people have come from a history of slavery, they will not become tired of fighting against this oppression. Is that a question?
Yes, it's a question. Can it also be personification because hopes cannot be spring?
Yes, yes indeed it could. It could be. Hopes springing high. Hopes cannot spring, hopes are not people, so hopes have been personified here. So these hopes could also represent the energy of inside the black people to fight against this racial discrimination. But still, she will continue to fight and still she'll rise.
In stanza 4, I'll be reading stanza 4 to you guys. Did you want to see me broken? Bowed head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries. The speaker's questions in this stanza are direct and pertinent, and appropriately accusing. Pertinent meaning relevant or applicable to a particular matter. She knows that her success is received with bitterness by the racist people in society. So she directs these questions at the society that has long tried to keep her oppressed. She asks if they'd like to see her broken, oppressed, depressed, and bitter. She asks these questions knowing that she is indeed what many people in society did not want. They did not want to see a black man rise up out of the oppression and society. And they did not want to see a black woman succeed. In stanza 5, Maya asks whether her haughtiness offends others. Don't take it awful hard, because I laugh like I've got gold mines digging in my own backyard. She continues with the questions directed at a racist society when she asks whether her haughtiness is offensive. She knows that society resents seeing a black woman being proud of herself. This question has an air of sarcasm, which serves to point out of hypocrisy of society as it is embittered by the success of an individual that has tried to oppress. She continues with a sarcastic tone. She tries to comfort the listener or the reader. She says, don't take it awful hard. This is her sarcastic way of pretending to care for those who resent her success. In stanza 6, she says, you may shoot me with your words, you may cut me with your eyes, you may kill me with your hatefulness, but still, like air, I'll rise. In stanza 6, she lets society know that no matter what it does to oppress her, they will not succeed. She lets society know that they cannot prevail against her with either words or looks. She proclaims that society cannot prevail against her, even if it managed to. have her killed because of its hatefulness, she claims that she will still rise like air.
Stanza 7. Does my sexiness upset you? Does it come as a surprise like I dance, like I've got diamonds at the meeting of my thighs? This is basically my Anglou showing an imagery of when she was young. A young woman dancing with joy, but she couldn't give any joy because of oppression. This stanza also shows us the pattern in this poem. Let me conduct an experiment with you. Gareth, ask Boipelo a question. Any question.
You like your life?
Boipelo, don't answer the question. We'll come back on it. The pattern in this poem is that it's a question and answer. It gives a question and then there's an answer. But, Gareth, I'm sure you want to know the answer to the question you asked Gareth Boipelo right now, right?
No.
Gareth. No. But generally, people want to know the answer to a question they ask. So if you ask a question, they expect a reply. So if there's no reply, you sit there in anticipation for the answer. In the 8th stanza, the 8th stanza, out of the heart of history's shame, I rise. Up from the past that's rooted in pain, I rise. I'm a black ocean, leaping. I'm a black ocean, leaping and wide, welling and swimming. I bear in the tide. Yes, right.
I want to get back to that question. What if it's a rhetorical question? What if it's a question that doesn't deserve an answer, or one that doesn't need one?
Even though it's a rhetorical question, someone ends up answering the question. Let me ask, are you awake? And you're clearly awake. You're gonna say yes.
Okay.
This is basically a history lesson. It shows that our the ancestors of these Americans fought for the freedom that they relish in today. It teaches them the hardships they had to transverse to make it to this point. And in stanza 9, leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into the daybreak that wondrous clear, I rise. Bringing gifts of my that my ancestors gave. I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise, I rise, I rise. This is basically, if I should sum it up, not in an offensive way, but slavery, if I could just paint a picture for you.
Okay. You know how we get extended metaphors? Do we get extended similes? Because throughout the poem, the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh stanza,
It's full of similes.
it's basically, yeah, she's comparing something to something. You get what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I get you.
Yeah.
That is the type of feeling we got when we were reading this poem. It just feels like a comparison throughout.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That is
Is
there.
An extended metaphor is when you compare one thing to another, and that same comparison is carried throughout the word. With these similes, you've got oil wells, you've got gold mines, so they're similar, the diamonds, but they're not the same.
Okay.
Just to paint a picture of what slavery was in a gentle way. Slavery is like a nightmare. The worst nightmare you could possibly have. A recurring nightmare that always comes back to you. Just like a student when writing an exam always scratches their head, not knowing the answer. Just basically like that. Basically, what we are, the current generation of this world, the current generation, we are the progression of the dream that our ancestors had. The progression that freedom will reign, that equality is, that will be equality between blacks, whites, colored, and all other races. We are the progression to realizing that dream of freedom.
We've handed out a page. Can you just read it out for me? Mr. Mabu, question 1. In which way does Maya Angelou's work have an impact on society?
I would say in a positive way because she's trying to let this typically the black society to know that even though you're oppressed, you can always overcome everything that is oppressing you by being proud of being black.
Maya Angelou's work has a definite impact on society. She has used her impeccable work on issues many do not have courage to speak about. And she has used her poems and her other works as her voice, a voice in which many people found hope in it. Her story is incredible. She has managed to turn her life around despite her situation. She saw this as a series of lessons. Sharing this made her beacon of hope to others. Question 2. Mrs. Matobi. Or Miss Matobi. What was the inspiration or the main reason behind the first book titled, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings?
Maybe, since you guys, that video about, how do I say this? Okay, let me just say freedom. You understand what I mean by that?
Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
Okay. Maya looked at the way people of her color were treated in her society. They were jailed and had no freedom of speech. In other words, she witnessed or was exposed to prejudice and discrimination at its highest level. Maya and her younger brother were sent to live with their grandmother, and at some point they were sent back to live with their mother. Throughout the memoir, Maya battles with emotions of chronic displacement, but also with other experiences such as racism and molestation. If you guys can take notes if you want, you can write it down on the question paper. Question 3, Mr. Marcello. What would one gain as an individual from engaging in or studying Maya Angelou's works?
I think studying her works would help build you as a person and also build confidence, self-confidence in you and force you to be able to stand and believe for what is right in life or society. Yeah.
Okay, we don't have much time left. Let me just do the last question. Maya captures her childhood struggles with abuse and prejudice. She describes how the contrasting freedom of her adolescence allowed her to find strength amongst despair. And yeah, I think we've come to the end of our lesson because we're running out of time for the analysis.
Yes, at the back you'll find a detailed analysis of the poem. You can study that for exams.
I don't have it.
Oh, sorry.
Just take this one.
That's a very good point. This is for exams.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously for Maya Angelou, it would be a choice of 2 poems, Still I Rise or the other classes one. So that you would answer the poem that your class studied. They did Human Family by Maya Angelou. You've done Still I Rise.
And I'd like to say something else.